Hi guys, and welcome to Ecology Notes, Ecological Succession. Ecological succession is a natural and gradual change in our ecosystem over time, and there's two separate categories of ecological succession, primary or secondary succession. Both of these represent gradual over time replacement of one plant community by another. And this, of course, incorporates other living organisms into it, like animals, but it's mostly focused on what's going on with the plants. And the reason why one is replacing the other usually has to do with the fact of who is getting the sunlight. So let's start with primary succession. Primary succession occurs on land that has never had soil on it before. So you're starting on bare rock. This could be due to a volcano erupting and covering the ecosystem with rock, glaciers as they melt and retreat and there's bare stone underneath, or even asteroids hitting the earth and blowing up a big crater in the earth that's all rock. So when this happens, we have these first organisms that show up that can live on rock, and these include lichens. All right, lichens can live on rock. They're not plants. They're a symbiotic relationship between two organisms, and they need no soil to survive. They do photosynthesis. And because they're the first ones to show up, they are called pioneer species. So here's some lichens. You've probably seen these things before and you might not have known what they were. So they grow right flat on the rocks here, sometimes on the sides of trees like we see here, and require no soil. They have no roots. They just stick to the surface. So when the lichens show up, they're going to do a couple things. One is they die, and when they die, they decompose, which then creates a little bit of soil. They also help to break up and weather some of that rock down. It also contributes to soil. So soil starts to form as the lichens and the forces of weathering and erosion break down these rocks into smaller and smaller pieces, as well as the organic material from the lichens when they decompose. All of this makes tiny little bits of soil, nothing that a tree could grow in or even a bush, but it's the beginning of this soil that could support larger plant life. So here you see a depression in the rock that has probably been eaten away by these lichens that are under here. And you have these small little plants just starting to grow up in that tiny bit of soil there. Right, and how the seeds got there, they were either blown in there, and seeds from larger plants get blown in there, and they just can't make it in that amount of soil. So it's only these guys who require a little bit that could make it. And so over time, these guys will arise as the soil gets a little bit deeper. The next thing that could show up are simple plants like mosses, because they don't require a lot of soil either, or ferns, okay? They can grow in these new little patches, and they do the same thing. They will further break up the rock, and they will also die and decompose and make more soil over time. All right, so if we have a rocky island appearing as oceanic waters recede, which of the following forms of vegetation would probably appear first on the bare rocks? Well, which ones can show up? Don't be tricked by pioneer trees, because there are pioneer species, but those are never trees. So if you're on bare rock, a rocky island, what's going to show up first is your lichens. So after we get our lichens, simple plants and simple plants arise, then these guys are going to die, adding more organic material. And as the soil thickens, now our grasses and wildflowers are going to grow. And they're going to take up the space the lichens and the mosses took up before. Because these guys are a little taller, they're going to soak up the light. And those guys that were underneath would die off. All right, so they're going to start taking over. All right, as these guys die, they're going to add even more nutrients to the soil. The soil is going to get a bit thicker, and then you can support small shrubs and some small trees starting to survive in here. Once you have shrubs and trees, that's really going to change things, because if you go and you look underneath your hedges in your yard or underneath trees, grasses and stuff aren't growing under there very well. It's because the trees and the shrubs are going to take up the sunlight. At this point, you're going to start having animals moving in, because these trees and shrubs can provide a more stable source of food. So you're going to get insects and there's some small birds and mammals moving in. And what was bare rock now supports a whole ecosystem. And then over time, you're going to reach what's called a climax community. So the climax of the end, like the climax of the movie, is the end of the movie where all the action occurs. So in the forest, the climax community is a stable group of plants and animals, especially trees, tall, mature trees that result at the end of succession. So in Virginia, we know we have a climax community of forest if there is a lot of oak and hickory trees present. That's what we see in our climax community. All right, so underneath these, there will be some small plants, but not as many. And depending on the ecosystem, what that climax community is going to look like varies. So for example, if you're in a prairie, the grasses, because it's a grassland, are the climax community. If you're in a desert, that's tall, mature cacti that are going to be your climax community. But for us, it's oak and hickory. So here's a diagram of primary succession. See, the whole process is one. So we have bare rocks, and then our pioneer species show up, and that's lichens right here that die and break up some of this rock. You get a little bit of soil, and you get your small little grasses, a little marsh soil, and you'll get some taller flowering plants. Some more soil over time, you got small trees and shrubs. And as the trees get larger, all the stuff underneath dies, which adds to the soil, and you get larger and larger ones. And then you get your oak and hickory in your climax community. And if you look at the time span of this is a long process. You're looking at hundreds to sometimes even thousands of years for this to occur because you're starting with no soil at all, and it takes a lot of time to build up that soil. And that's important because we're going to compare that time span to secondary succession, which is the other kind. So here's secondary succession, which is a little bit different because you start with soil already there. This is an ecosystem that previously was probably a climax community or something happened to it, and you already have soil and it was disturbed. So you're disturbing what was once the home of living organisms. This occurs much, much faster because the soil is already there, and within the soil are also seeds. And you can also have different pioneer species because you don't necessarily need lichens anymore because you have soil already there. And so this is caused by fires, so think wildfires in the forest, tornadoes, tearing things down, even clearing land for farming can do this. So what grows after the disturbance? So you have a climax community and you have a disturbance. The next thing that grows, according to the diagram, is small grasses. Because again, it doesn't necessarily need to be lichens for secondary succession. So looking at secondary, here I have my disturbance of a fire, and you can see the soil's already there, including all the seeds that would be in it. That actually puts a lot of nutrients into the soil, and the seeds grow back relatively quickly. So within a year or two, you're already having some small annual plants showing up, and then you get these larger flowering plants, and then you're back to shrubs and trees relatively quickly, and then your climax community of oak and hickory. So remember, in primary succession, we were looking at hundreds to thousands of years, and now we're looking at not even 200 years to get to a climax community. So it's much, much quicker than the previous one. So a fire destroys several hundred acres of forest. This happens in California every year. Which of these would you first expect to observe growing in the months immediately following the fire? So what would grow first? What do you guys think? Vines. Vines grow really, really quickly out of the ground. They don't have a woody stalk to them. So shrubs and trees, they require a lot more energy put into them. You might see some grasses pop up quickly too, but usually vines. A forest of pine trees is burned over a 10-mile area when lightning strikes a tree. In the spring, a few seedlings have begun to sprout. This is an example of secondary. Well, if you have a forest that's been burned, then the soil is already there. So yes, that is indeed secondary succession. The old-growth forest has remained the same combination of hickories and oaks for 100 years. This is an example of, so if you got hickory and oak, that is your climax community. So pioneer species are the first to show up, not the last. So that would be lichens or small grasses if it's secondary. All right. A climax community is a mature forest. This is correct, but they do have a particular name for it. Climax community. All right, so for the following slides, determine which are examples of primary succession and which are examples of secondary succession. So this is an example of, so it's on fire, that means it already has soil. So hopefully you know that this is secondary succession. A glacier has scraped all soil from a rocky area. As it slowly retreats, some of the rock is broken down by weathering. Some moss begins to grow. So this is happening on bare rock. That's primary succession. So even though there was soil there, it was all scraped off. So you're restarting with bare rock. This picture is an example of, so this is volcanic rock, all right, covering everything. So you're going to have pure rock. That is going to be primary. We're going to have to build that soil. All right, guys, that's all I got for now. Ta-ta.